What I call the new Arab public sphere, Mark wrote, is palpably transforming Arab political culture. It has already conclusively shattered the state's monopoly over information, rendering obsolete the ministries of information and the oppressive state censorship that was smothering public discourse. While this new Arab public cannot alone substitute for electoral democracy, it is doing something in many ways that is more important, building the underpinning of a more liberal, more pluralistic politics rooted in a vocal, critical public sphere. In his newest book, Mark shows us the still unfolding results of this new public sphere that he foresaw many years ago and what it means for both US policy and the people of the region. He cautions us, though, that the Arab popular uprisings that we're seeing today are not nearly as new as many Americans would like to believe. And he cautions that there's no guarantee that today's revolutions will usher in the sort of democratic politics that most Americans would either recognize or hope for.
This is not a Twitter revolution or a Facebook revolution, but definitely these new social media were very important, and mainly what was, I think he would agree with me, the outstanding importance of satellite technology and satellite stations, the saturation of the region with satellite stations that also made a difference in the Arab uprising. So he brings in that kind of knowledge of this new medium. The other thing that he brings to the discussion is an intimate knowledge of Washington. We all know many scholars who live in their own little world and they write good books, but they have really absolutely no idea about how decisions are made in Washington. And he knew many people in the Obama administration, and that allows him really to focus on what the Obama administration did, and probably more importantly, what it did not do during the uprising. And I think there is a great deal of nuanced understanding and analysis of the decision-making process that the Obama administration went through. So
I can understand that, and I can study that over time. And then this sudden eruption of change around the region, in a sense, those are the manifestations. Those are the symptoms, which you can then study on a case-by-case basis. But one of the things that I think the book tries to do, and hopefully succeeds at, is to place those eruptions within the context of those long developing, long brewing structural changes. You can't understand the response to Mohamed Bouazizi if you don't understand the history of Tunisian riots in the South in the 1980s and all the way through. You can't understand the response to Khalid Said in Egypt in January 25th without going back to the Kafaya movement and those incredibly brave, bold, and we at the time we thought foolhardy and crazy bloggers and activists who went out on street corners holding signs saying no to the succession of Gamal Mubarak. It seemed hopeless at the time, and yet they did it anyway.
but there is a subtext, if you will, that connects all of these uprisings into one kind of regional narrative, regional public space, shared identity, which is, I mean, that these words always appear in the book.
The roots of the idea that Yemenis are inspired by Tunisia goes back to the regional response to the Second Intifada, to the American invasion of Iraq, to the response to the war in Gaza, to the response to the war in Lebanon. This sense of an entire region united by, these are the things which make us Arab. We care about these things because this is who we are. And so a Yemeni or a Syrian or an Egyptian looks at Tunisia and he doesn't say, well, that's interesting what they are doing. He says, this is what we are doing and we should be doing the same thing. And especially in those first few months, just the tight integration of the protest was impossible to miss. It was also about the ability to control public sphere, to control ideas, to prevent people from even thinking about challenging. And I think we are never going back to that. I think that it is simply impossible at this point for any Arab regime, no matter how oppressive, to restore that condition of not just physical, but mental and public silence. The real counter-revolution, in my opinion, is led by the regimes and the forces of the status quo. whether that's the military in Egypt or Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the GCC, which basically sought very early on to limit the spread of the revolutions and to contain them. And so in places like Egypt, that meant trying to prop up the military and kind of block more radical revolutionary change. But elsewhere in the region, I mean, I wrote a blog post about this a couple weeks ago, and I talk about this in the book, that there's this amazing single week in March when basically you see this is when the empire strikes back. This is when Saudi forces roll into Bahrain and completely crush the protest movement there. And I don't think they've actually won there. I think they simply bought themselves a generation worth of trouble. But they did go in and clear the streets and bulldoze Pearl Roundabout. That same week is when Yemeni military snipers opened fire in Sana'a University and the army splits, and what had been a peaceful protest movement turns into a military standoff and a really bloody few months. It's the week when the Egyptian referendum happens. It's the same week that NATO begins bombing in Libya, and it's the same week when the first protests break out in Daraa in Syria. And so kind of across the region, this is a single week when you go from this tightly unified, seemingly unstoppable wave of change to all of a sudden the fragmentation of the regional agenda, the introduction of war and violence, and kind of the real shift in tone. At this point, our only hope is that the Egyptians prove to be as advanced as the Ennahda party in Tunisia, where it was Ennahda, the Tunisian equivalent of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which basically stepped up and said, no, we're not going to base the constitution on Sharia, on Islamic law, which is a pretty shocking position for an Islamist party to take if you think about it. But they're playing a long game. They are thinking about trying to create a robust set of political institutions which are going to benefit them. And so it's not like they're acting against self-interest, but they're savvy enough to recognize that there's a significant portion of the population that is not Islamist, that doesn't want to be dominated by Islamism, and they want to reassure them. Generally speaking, the administration has been very good about not trying to make this all about us, not trying to, say, oh, American leadership of the democracy movement. They were absolutely right that this was not about us, and the region was not crying out for American leadership on this. And I think they were right to see early on that the inevitability of this change, that this was a serious comprehensive change and wanting to get on the right side of it. I don't see us going back to the way things were. And in a sense, a lot of the policy debate in the United States is about, should we or should we not have kind of done this? But the point is, it was going to happen without us. It wasn't about us, and in a sense, responding to it and trying to position ourselves in such a way as to be able to align ourselves with this Arab public without compromising on our core interests and values, I think is going to be the defining challenge of American policy in the Middle East for the next decade or two. And I think it's a good time to start thinking about it. So thank you all.